Right. Good evening. I'd like to call to order the March 26th, 2024 work session. Start with item 3, budget and finance. Item 3.01, capital area intermediate unit operating budget 2024-2025.
We're just going to go right to Mr. Longwell.
I was going to say Mr. Longwell.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Leddy, Mr. Rupp. So in the attachment is the capital area intermediate unit general operating budget. And so while it's budget season for us, it's also budget season for a lot of our affiliated entities or our partners. So as the board has previously reviewed the CTC budget, we also review the CAIU general operating budget. And so I would just draw your attention to the very last page of that PDF, the attachment. Shows all of the school districts and what their contributions are to the general operating budget. And so that's a mandate from the state level that all the IU districts in any given IU help contribute to the operating budget. I know Mr. Bradley has done a nice job, I think, of articulating as our IU rep that there are many budgets at the IU. The operating budget is just one of them. They also have a variety of, I'll call them business type budgets or proprietary type budgets. But this one is what the districts fund directly with a contribution, and there is no increase again this year, as has been the case for a number of years. And so in that very last page of the PDF, there's a lot of good information in there, but just to draw the board's attention to it, the last page shows those contributions, and that second blue column, column 9, shows there's no increase in contributions. So.
Questions for Mr. Longwell?
And as Mr. Longwell mentioned, the IU has some 50+ budgets that they maintain. Most of those budgets are program driven, and they're individual. They receive funding from the state, from the federal, from some grants, and they have to balance against each one of those individual. This is the only operating budget is the only one that all the participating school districts have to approve for them to allow them to continue to do the general operations of the IU. The rest of them are separate, and they're not something that the school districts worry about.
Thank you for your oversight of the other 49 budgets, so we don't have to look at those. Thank you.
Yes, Thursday I'll see quite a few.
All right. Further questions? We'll move this forward to April 10th for a vote. Very good. Item 3.02, general fund budget expense 2024-2025. Mr. Longwell.
So keep throwing curveballs at you here, Mr. Rupp. Sorry about that. So I'll kick this off for you. The two-part presentation here. We did the revenue part first, which is sometimes a little more fun to see what money's coming in, and tonight we're going to talk about what money's going out and the expenses related to operating the district and projecting that into the 24-25 school year. So as typical, I get to do the pictures, and Mr. Longwell does the important numbers, right? But the pictures here are representative of the reality of what's happening in the district. Construction continues. Technology and continuing to replace technology is a significant part of our budget. Obviously, our enrollment numbers continue to increase, and as we've been talking, trying to stay competitive in the field with our vendors and our employees, specifically they're represented through transportation and school buses, is something that is an example of some things we need to do in order to meet all of the needs of all of our students. No small undertaking.
As we begin to kind of look at the numbers here, I think we always like to try to stare at the 50,000-foot view and just share a big picture summary of where we are with our budget. And so at our part 1 presentation, where we did look at revenue, we talked about the projected revenue being about $97.2 million. We did discuss with the board at that time that those numbers included, we added to it rather, those numbers that would include a 1% set aside in real estate tax increase to fund our continuing construction plan and our financing plan. That takes us to an adjusted total revenue of $97.754 million. And The next step then is to kind of pair that together then with our total expenditure proposal for the school board. And so where we've landed based on all of our budget meetings, looking at our staff proposals, making adjustments to what can go in the budget or what might need to be deferred or not something that we're able to do, that brings us to total expenditures of about $101 million, $101.5 million. And so our preliminary budget deficit was $3.8 million. Now, as we discussed in part one of our budget presentation, we knew that there was a need for some additional tax increase to support operations, right? Because that 1% really is to help kind of pay the mortgage payment, so to speak. It's the cost of our financing plan. And so as we look at that 3.8 million, our proposal then to bring the deficit down to a place where we want it is to add another 2.9% to that to get us to a total budget deficit of $2.38 million. And so the total proposed tax increase would be ultimately 3.9%. Something I think we've probably talked about with the board, maybe in the fall when we adopted our index, is that the base index for all of the school districts in the state is 5.3%. That's the very top limit. School districts with a market value aid ratio of above 0.4 get an adjustment factor. We're one of those districts, so our adjusted index is actually 6.5%. Our proposal is that between what we're setting aside for financing plan and construction and also our operations, that we would be at 3.9%.
And that adjustment, there's a couple things that's one of the highest numbers I can ever remember. And that adjustment is based on statewide look at what's the costs of things. Said simply, the cost of everything has increased, and therefore it allows the districts to go with a higher tax increase. The challenge is that the adjustment is based on saying to a district, well, we know that you aren't at the level that you could be compared to other districts, and so here's some more that you could tax related to that. So obviously, no one is interested in going to 6.5%, and yet 3.9 is, again, it's a significant increase for sure.
What was the increase last year?
The increase last year was 325, I believe, but we'll get to that in the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
So.
What year is this 4 out of 5 for that 1% construction increase?
So we've been increasing since 1819 was when we first began phasing in our debt. And so as the board probably recalls, our plan, when we knew that enrollment was growing and we knew that there were infrastructure needs, we set up a prioritization. We started the kindergarten academy, then we moved to some of our other elementaries, and we were borrowing all along the way. And then we were also phasing in millage all along the way so that we were never doing it all in 1 year. So our increase rate ranged from 1 to 1.5%, and we'll see that also later in the presentation.
I think to your question, we have 3 left.
Oh, 3 left. I'm sorry. How many are left? Yeah.
I think total of 8 years, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah. So this year and then.
Thank you.
And who sets that? What is that?
That's what, when we did our financing plan separate from this, that in order to fund the financing plan, that's what we had agreed to as board, we'd allocate that much.
You might get into this, so sorry if you
No.
did. What was last year or on average when we're looking at 2.388
That's a good
for the
question.
million? What is, because I remember the first year I went on the board, I was like, well, where are we going to, but then you told me,
Yep.
listen, there's always a budget deficit when we do this. What was it last year, if you could, or?
So it was around 2.3 million. And in fairness, if you go back 8 years, it probably was more like, I'll just say $1 million, $6 million, $7 million, $8 million, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Really, and I'm glad you asked that question because I was going to get to this. This is something we've talked about with cabinet, Dr. Lay, myself, because of the way we budget and the conservative approach we take. The 2.3 million really represents operating risk. And so if we have a bad year and things don't go in our favor, and we're willing to use $2.3 million out of our fund balance. Now, our goal is to break even. And if we have a little bit of a surplus, then that might go to the capital reserve fund. That, you know.
Going well, so when you describe a bad year, you mean tax collections aren't where we estimate them to be, the EIT tax, those types of things. It's not a school district issue. It's a matter of the assumptions you make in the budget don't bear out by technology.
I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, that's a good question as well. So a bad year, as an example, we trend healthcare at 8%, for example, because that's what the average has been over a 3, 5, 7, 10-year period of time. But we have had years where maybe it was 20% or 22% because we didn't have good utilization that year. And so in those 20% years, on a $10 million line item, that's going to be a big number that is over budget, right? You know, and so that contributes to ultimately the budget deficit. And so we try to manage that carefully, in that we know you don't want to rely on fund balance because that's your savings account. But ultimately, because of the way we budget and our approach to it, this is what we're willing to say is our operating risk. That if we didn't have a year that went in our favor for any number of reasons, then 2.3 million out of our total fund balance is manageable.
And a lot of this is educated guess, right? And I emphasize educated, but the guess part is associated, for instance, with the governor's budget. My first year, I've told this story several times. My first year, I got a letter from the governor saying, make sure you put this in your budget. And then another letter from the state legislator saying, don't you dare put that in your budget, right? And so what do? Well, we said probably be about 50% of what the proposal was. And so we're constantly trying to predict, based on best guess, what we should put in there on that side. We also try to be more conservative with that. Sure.
There's an art and science to it. It's where you find the comfort spot, because to Dr. Leidy's point, we don't want to be so aggressive in our assumptions that we make that number real and have a $2 or $3 or $4 million deficit that drags into multiple years. We also don't want to be so conservative in our estimate that how does that impact tax increases in our reserves? And so I would suggest that a good way to kind of a question of how do we know our budget process is working and good is maybe even looking at your fund balance percentage, right? Because if the fund balance, if the savings account is pretty stable year over year and we're happy with where it's at, that suggests that over a year over year process, the annual revenues and expenses, like things are going well. If you've gone through your fund balance in 3 years, then spending, there's something going on in the budget that's not good, it's a problem. If your fund balance triples in 3 years, then that might also be an issue if you weren't planning for that to happen, that maybe you weren't aggressive enough in your budget. So
Greg, how do you pick from 2.9 versus 3%?
yeah, I think honestly it gets to the budget deficit. Where are we comfortable? And so at 2.3 million, that's where we were last year, and it's probably not too far off of where we were the year before. And in that area, based on how we fared in our budget process, that's the number we're comfortable with. And so in some ways it's triangulating, because it's saying we know we have to adjust the budget, and we'll talk about that later tonight. What expenses are increasing in the budget? What revenues are increasing in the budget? When you put all that together, then, and I know Dr. Leidy's talked about this, kind of looking at kind of 3 areas, you know, to what degree are we willing to say we might use some of our fund balance? To what degree do we need to look at maybe a tax increase? And to what degree do we just make budget adjustments that some things, you know, we might defer, like, so even staffing, and we'll talk about this to Dr. Leidy's thunder, but what were the total staff requests? Maybe we're not fulfilling all of the total staff requests because we're deferring some things. And so it's a combination of all those things to get to where we want to be. So kind of pulling ourselves out of the individual line items, I think it's maybe good to categorize things and kind of look at the expenses and what are some themes that we're seeing. And so I'll share generally that the 4 main bullet points there you see: enrollment and program, inflation, energy, construction, and recurring costs. Those are kind of the 4 buckets, if you will. You know, when you look at the individual line items at your leisure, there's a budget binder that Mrs. Ely deserves a tremendous amount of credit for her role in the budget process, but also cabinet and our building administrators, our teacher leaders. But in assembling the budget, there's a lot of detail in the binder itself. But if I were to say, here's the 4 kind of buckets, it's around enrollment program, inflation and energy, construction, which is our financing plan that we discussed, and then recurring costs like healthcare and charter schools. So this is another way to look at those 4 buckets. So if you kind of take a little bit of a step further and say, okay, so what about enrollment and program increased, and what about construction increased? What about inflation, energy, and what about recurring costs? So in our budget, total expenditure changes were about 7.7 million. And so if you think about it through these 4 lenses or 4 buckets, that enrollment program, 3.3 million of it is from enrollment and program, frankly. And so, as an example, staff requests, which we'll talk about a little bit later, we are a growing school district, rapidly growing. When you look back 10, 12 years, probably the top 10 at least. I think at one point we were 6th fastest growing in the state. And so staffing that, maintaining programs, that's a big part of it. Student services, and we have some presentations later on in the evening around that. We do have a growing special ed population in addition to growing enrollment, and so we obviously want to make sure we're providing the services that are needed there, and so there's some costs associated with that. And then I'm not going to necessarily touch on all of the individual topics because that's in the budget binder, but just calling out some of the big ones. Construction, the financing plan, that is about the 1% that we talked about. So you see on the revenue side increase, and then you see on the expenditure side and also increase. And then inflation, energy, I think like everybody, even at a personal level, we've seen our electric bills go up. We've seen other costs at the grocery store, at the hardware store. And so when we look at our cost centers, we're seeing increases there, especially driven by inflation and energy. And then finally, recurring costs. So personnel costs are maintaining our salaries, our benefits, all of those things for our existing staff. And then commercial charter school, without going into a lot of detail, we're continuing to see that rise for a variety of reasons. In part because as our costs rise, the tuition rate that we pay the charter schools is based on our own costs. And so that's happening at a state level for all 500 school districts. That's some of the conversations that are happening around advocacy. So that was a $950,000 increase, again, contributing to the total increase in the budget.
So when you think about how much the district has changed in basically a 10-year period, you see it represented there at the graph, but then you also see this idea of 21% growth. That's significant amount of growth. And I've heard Greg say several times, we've essentially added the equivalent of a small school district to Mechanicsburg. And when you look at the size of many of the districts and even our region, let alone across the state. So those increases obviously come with additional expenditures. This is a way of looking at our staffing. Even though in the middle we have students, the reality is we're here because of those students. And so they are at the center of that. And these concentric circles represent the individuals that have direct contact with our students in the first circle, and then the building non-instructional and instructional supports within those individual buildings, and then from a district office perspective. Our focus has traditionally been to make sure that we are never compromising on the black circle there that is connected to direct relationships with our students. But we also can't forget that as those numbers increase, it puts additional burdens and stresses on being able to provide support and accountability in the other circles. So when you look at the ratio of new staff that are proposed this year, I think it's intriguing to see that the majority is still in that black circle, and then it decreases as we go out, but we're not ignoring those outer circles. So as we go through the budget process and we're developing what the budget looks like, our administrators have the opportunity to bring forward positions that they believe are necessary to meet the needs of our students. And this year, 21 of those positions came forward. We are recommending that 17 of those 21 be included in this year's budget, and that's a cost of $1.275 million. That's additional cost based on those new staff requests. So more specifically, and this is what I meant about the ratio, you'll see that instructionally speaking, of those new positions, 13 of those positions show direct connection to working with students. And those 13 positions are outlined there under instructional and instructional support. Again, like Mr. Longwell, I won't necessarily speak to each one of those, but maybe some of the ones that have more questions associated with them. The K-3 literacy coach is an approach that we are taking to supporting our teachers with an individual that has an expertise in the area of literacy at the primary level, and will be working one-on-one or with small groups of teachers. The coordinator of career education and workforce development, very excited about that. As someone who came out of the high school level, I see this as an opportunity to help our students understand what the transition opportunities are for them from being at high school into not just automatically thinking I'm going to go to college for 4 years, but thinking beyond that to what is the career that you want, what's the education you need, and for some of our kids, realizing that through workforce development, there are opportunities out there for them that are pretty phenomenal in terms of what they can make and wages, et cetera. So excited about that position. Under the instructional support, instructional positions, I just wanted to point out the MDS addition because there's actually several positions associated with that. MDS are students that are typically in self-contained classrooms who have multiple disabilities. We're utilizing this class as what's called a consortium class, where we are partnering with 5 other districts and providing this service to not only the students in Mechanicsburg, but students in the region who have multiple disabilities. Other school districts actually provide funding for that classroom, and so we take the funding and we compile it together to be able to serve the needs of those kids. And the rest in that category I think is pretty self-explanatory, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Under support services, as those inner circles continue to grow, obviously our need to support technology has increased, and just the sheer square footage in our building has increased significantly, and so the addition of 2 custodians speaks to that. And then finally, my gift to the board is the communication specialist that the board has requested, and it's a legitimate request and something that I think as a district now we have gotten to the point where we need someone to make sure that we're helping to tell our story to the community overall. So there's a lot on that slide, a lot of positions there, and obviously a significant amount of resources in the expenditure side of the equation associated with those positions.
So as we kind of pull out of the weeds, and we've talked about this over the years with the board, and I think it helps to kind of tell the story a little bit about what is the composition of our budget, right? And so personnel is around 70%, and that's been typical. Debt service, I'll call that out, at 9%. The kind of the benchmark or the threshold, almost like the how do we know, generally you like to see that around 10% or less in school districts. And so that goes back to even the financing plan and how we stepped our millage in. And I think frankly a credit to this school board and also prior school boards in our planning for addressing such significant enrollment growth, looking at the building projects, phasing in all the debt in a stepped, measured kind of way, and also the millage associated with it, without depleting our fund balance or putting us in any kind of issues. So the other categories then, supplies and equipment, 6%. And then contracted services, I'll say contracted services is a bucket that includes a lot of different things. It's 16%, but contracted services includes everything from what the IU does for us, to our transportation contractor, to student services and outside placements. It is a variety of things, and there is more detail in your budget binder ultimately. But just as a categorical general sense of where we're spending our money, I think this is a good illustration of that. This slide, yep, sorry.
If you're gonna get to this later, you can tell me so, but
No.
So I don't really see any, outside of debt service, any other building expenses. Are those?
So a lot of the building expenses probably fall into, if it's coming through our departments, our instructional departments, our teacher leaders, our non-instructional departments, a lot of that supplies and expenses probably, or I'm sorry, supplies and equipment rather. There are some contracted services there for that, but I would say they get rolled up into some of those other buckets. They're either in supplies and equipment or contracted services, instruction and support. And so to Dr. Lieba's point, and this is where I will credit the staff, our teacher leaders, our administrators, cabinet. We have a very, very thorough budget process. That's not to say that other school districts don't, but we have over 40 cost centers. So over 40 people individually are responsible for some aspect of a budget. And then there's at least one budget meeting associated with each one of those 40 meetings, 40 cost centers, I should say. And so their budgets ultimately are rolled up into the master general fund budget and then are in one of those probably 2 buckets that I shared.
So, I mean, we've, in the process of, we've already approved the HVAC system at Elmwood.
Oh, right.
Like, would that fall into debt service or?
That's a good question. So the HVAC, that's a good preview for even the presentation that's coming.
Okay,
On the
and
work
you
session.
can-
No, this is fine. This is good. Set me up good. I like it. The need for facilities extends beyond just kind of the annual payment. I kind of liken it to, so that's coming out of the capital reserve fund to answer your question, but I kind of liken it to even your home. When you put a roof on your home, you're probably saving some money and you're seeing like, what's the timeline I want to do that by? You're setting aside money. That's the same way that we use our capital reserve fund, is to have a savings account to say, over a 3, 5, 7 year planning horizon, what are some facility projects that we see as being needed? The HVAC is one of them, and that's coming out of the capital reserve fund, which is another kind of bucket of money yet.
So a little bit of a misnomer, but we call them one-time costs, even though they're not. And so they're not really incorporated into the annual budget.
Okay, yeah, that was gonna be my question, like where in this pie graph does that show up? Gotcha, okay.
And we do that in a way to try to insulate the general fund from kind of spikes. And so if you had to all of a sudden absorb, we see the $7.7 million increase in expenses. If all of a sudden you had to absorb a $3 or $4 million increase for an HVAC system, you kind of create these spikes in the budget in the general fund. And so rather, when it comes to significant price tag like that, we try to take it out of the capital reserve fund, kind of that savings account, to say, what are we looking at in the future, the next 3, 5, 7 years? And that kind of connects to the facilities planning discussion that we're going to have a little bit later.
And I would affirm that, in my experience, the way you all work with the budget process is amazing, so.
Thank you.
I think this pie chart is just helpful in terms of when you were, the questions earlier about where are we in the tax increase we're thinking about. It's like, well, kind of, if 2/3 of the budget are more so our personnel, and of that group, we know that this contracted budget, the CBA agreement is in the 3% range, give or take, per year, which is fine. Like, we already knew what that was, so like knowing that the non-building, the non-debt service portion of this is 2.9% is an increase this year with increased staff. And like I was kind of building on your comment of good job with how the budget being put together. But when you and I talked about this number when we went over the agenda, and like, there's a good rule of thumb, like, oh, of course it's near 3%. That's where our biggest expense is. We know we have that, an increase around 3%. So I think it seems reasonable based on what you're just talking about right here.
Thank you. So we talked a little earlier about how do we know where the budget is, and are we satisfied the direction we're heading? We talked a little bit about the fund balance percentage earlier, because I think that's a cumulative indicator of how we've been doing year over year. But also, I think another example of that is our expense or revenue per ADM. And so I know we have a veteran board, but for the community and public as well, this is really looking at our total revenue, and ADM is average daily membership. And so it's saying, we're trying to get to our total revenue broken down per average daily membership. And that's looked at a state level, at our IU level, which is Perry County, Dauphin County, and Cumberland County, but also looking at what's that mean for Mechanicsburg. And so this is a good return on investment to be able to see that in terms of revenue, we actually collect less revenue per student than what's happening at the state average, and also what's happening at the IU average, that tri-county area. And likewise, in terms of expense per student, we're also spending less per student than when you're benchmarking against what's happening spending per state, spending at the state level per student, and spending at the IU level per student. So these are some of the benchmarks that we look at the bigger picture to say, how are we doing with the budget, and is it heading in the direction we want it to? So.
It's actually impressive because we're one of the most rapidly growing school districts. So all of our expenses are how do I put it, like more recent expenses, because we're rapidly growing. So to be under that is impressive.
And pretty high performing too.
Correct,
So
that's
bang
correct.
for your buck, return on investment, whatever term you want to use.
And we're managing massive growth.
Yeah. So this was the chart I alluded to a little bit earlier. It shows I'll just kind of draw the board's attention to a couple things. In the very far right column, in that beige shaded column is the adjusted Act 1 index for any one of those years. Then in the kind of the blue columns there, the three, you can see the furthest right of the blue columns was the total increase in that year. And so the year prior was 325. The year before that was 3.7. But as we've always talked about with the board, and this ties probably a little bit to Ms. Morgan's point, we've been setting aside a percentage for construction and financing plan. And so you can see then what the total increase was in any one of those years, but then you can also see what the percentage was that we set aside for our kind of our financing plan, the mortgage payment, but also what was the percentage that we set aside for ultimately just general operations, which I think is what Mr. Sanker was heading for. And again, I think this is worthy of kind of a call out. When you look at all the way back to 1819, we have remained below 3% for our operating increases. Certainly, acknowledging that when you add in the construction, that obviously pushes it higher in some of those years. But I think continuing to manage such a rapidly growing school district, what are we doing around our facilities? How are we doing with staffing, maintaining program, all while trying to navigate what we do around tax increases and fund balance? I think that's how you kind of put it all together. So.
We're going to get into where each bucket that operational percentage increase is coming from, because it's obviously much greater, but it's a lot greater this year than it's been traditionally.
Yeah. And I think when you look at it, I think in particular, when you go back to the expenses, those four themes, you can see some pretty big numbers on there, especially around charter school, right? For instance, that $950,000, that was a pretty significant increase. I mean, for my 8 years that I've been at Mechanicsburg, and honestly, when I was at a prior district before that, when you look at the percentage, that is not unique to Mechanicsburg, though. I know from talking to colleagues at a regional level or state level, everybody's seeing an increase in charter schools, what's happening in enrollment, and we're having those conversations internally with cabinet to say how do we manage that. But I would say driving some of that operating increase, Dr. Rhodes, to your point, is probably some bigger things around like healthcare, charter school,
which is all stuff that we're asking the state to fix. I think our constituents need to hear that. I mean, I understand that we have a lot of say at the board level, but these operational percentage increases that we have to educate our kids. But these increases, we're asking the state to fix a lot of these problems, like increases in healthcare issues and charter schools, special education, things like this, where I think the state is slow to get on board. Well, who pays that? Our constituents, the ones that we yell at us every day in the grocery store for increasing their taxes.
And I think to your point, you raise around advocacy, just to make a connection to that part one presentation we had around revenue. If the board recalls, we're not seeing corresponding increases in special ed or student service revenue from the state.
Correct.
Proportionally to the expenses we're seeing. And so when we see a $900,000 increase in student services, we have an incredible program. They're doing a great job of managing those expenses, but the state's not coming to say, hey, let's match that percentage increase in terms of funding necessarily. And so charter school likewise. And so there's some pressures in the budget that are contributing to those things. So.
If you take a look at that last column of 6.5, that's how much we could be raising taxes, and we're still, compared to that number, we're still well below what has been done in the years previous, with all the inflation and everything going on, now all the expenses going up. So I think that's a credit to the budgeting process.
Greg, I'm really concerned about the 3.9% increase, though, because that's the highest we've ever raised.
Mm-hmm.
What is the likelihood of that changing by the time we have to adopt this?
So I would see this as our
going down when you say change, or
why are you concerned?
Yeah. What?
do you mean going down when you say changing, or going up? Or
Down.
either?
Well, either, I guess. I don't want it to go any higher, but I'm like, it would be a pleasant surprise if you came back to us and said, oh, we're only gonna raise this 3.6.
20 years, it's not changed from this presentation. I'm just being realistic about it. Like it's, you would, in order to adjust that, you would either have to go with a higher operating risk or you would have to significantly reduce the number of staff that we just talked about. And that's the challenge that we're constantly facing. There's staff in there that we've already set off to the side, and to do more of that, I think, begins to damage what we're doing with students. I think that, yes, the 3.9 is high, but you also have to look at that far column, that 6.5 is basically what we're being told is what you need just to keep up with inflationary costs. And that's just the reality of matching those numbers.
I understand all that, but I'm just, it's learn.
It's kind of ironic that, sorry if I'm interrupting again. It's kind of ironic that at a state level, we haven't made these adjustments that need to be adjusted, but they're really quick to adjust the Act 1 index to 6.5.
Yeah.
I mean, I just.
Formula based.
Correct. Like, is that ironic? Is that the word I'm looking for? But it's just, it kind of upsets me a little bit. It basically, you know, it passes the buck on to local school boards. And while I don't like that,
particularly local school boards with growing student population.
100%. And it just, what everybody needs to realize is what that means is they are very comfortable making our constituents pay through taxes.
Always have been.
But the state is not willing to have difficult conversations around charter schools.
So I will say this, if something amazing happens with the state budget, and we know that by May, and the chance of that is 0 to none, right? Then who knows, maybe, but that's not gonna
I mean,
happen.
Dr. Woods, the state tax rate hasn't changed in 20 years. What you pay in like state income tax, right? And yet you can tax more if you'd like to based on, you local entities can do that, but the state's not going to.
Yeah, because we're great at the state
Right,
level.
we
We're
manage
gonna
money
really
at
help
this,
our
you know, and,
constituents.
yeah, so, and, you know, there's a $14 billion rainy day fund, we want to spend it down to 11 billion, and it's like, the end of the world, like, I don't understand, and meanwhile, we're trying to, we project a budget deficit that we, you know, at worst, will spend out of our fund balance.
And the trick is, you know, with the operating risk is, and this gets into why we generally don't adjust between now and, to Dr. Leahy's point, the final budget adoption is, we've already kind of went back and sharpened our pencil through kind of the fall and the winter months to say, in those 3 areas, you know, those 3 areas saying, what expenses have to just be cut out of the budget, what can be deferred, where are we happy in terms of that operating risk, and saying, what might we be willing to use out of our fund balance, and then where are we finding kind of a just right spot with the tax increase. And so it's a balance, frankly, with all of those things. The risk is that if you go back to any one of those 3 areas and are too aggressive, it could position us in a way that, like, for instance, if we just went out and said, you know, every year the governor's proposal is always going to be right, we could be too aggressive in state funding, and then we fall short and we end up using our fund balance. And so we always try to find that just right balance.
Well, I know you do an excellent job.
Yeah.
I just every year, just a little higher, a little higher, a little
Yeah.
higher.
So is that strictly, that adjusted Act 1 index, is that strictly on inflation?
So it's a combination of things. It's inflationary factors, but they also look at state wages. It's a composite or rate that gets calculated. But inflation is inflationary factors are a part of it.
So really, we need to wait for wages to come and rise to meet inflation. And in lieu of that, the tax rate is allowed to increase. And hopefully the employers get the memo that their employees' taxes are going up because of this.
Well, you said the EIT was higher, it's high this year, right?
For the last couple of years, it has been higher, yes. Yeah.
Wages are going up.
Yeah, so you can see that, and that's a piece of evidence that that's happening, yes. So in terms of the tax increase, we always like to show the board kind of where we are with our median assessed value and our tax impact. I'll say the reason we use the median versus the average is that it's right in the middle of the data set, right? You know, and so if you look at those 4 areas, I know it's funny to see Laurel and Annex, but we'll talk about that in a second. But those are our municipalities that comprise the school district, and so the district median assessed value from the county is 191,800. And so the next two lines down show what the average annual tax bill was for 23-24, and then ultimately what the average annual tax bill will be for 24-25. And you can see the average annual tax, again, based on that median, because I don't want to misrepresent, is $117 annually. And so if you have a home that's assessed at about 191,000, it's $117 a year is what that 3.9% comes out to. Now, again, that's the median, so if you're above or below that, it's going to look different based on your home's value. But so. This is another point of reference, benchmarking, if you will, to say where are we in terms of kind of Cumberland County and our peers. And so when you look at our real estate tax rate, you can see we're in that 4th position, which is where it's pretty typical for us being around that 4th position. And so that shows our real estate tax rate for 22-23. It shows the real estate tax rate that we enacted for 23-24. And again, this is another opportunity to benchmark to see how we're doing in our budget process. The reason 24-25 is not there is because, like us, everybody's having these conversations right now in the months of March and April, and so more to come as that goes. So.
I think this chart is, I know it's been in every budget book for 20 years, and I think that it's less useful than it was when we had a more steady population, student population. And when you look at these districts, and even between us and CV, that are the only two that are growing of these in general among the West Shore districts or Cumberland County districts. Like it's like just one dimension. It's not telling a full story, because you could say, well, why is CV where it is? But we know why CV is the way it is, because it has a much larger tax base and can the millage factor is they get $2.70 for every dollar we get if we raise millage. So like it's not as helpful as I think it probably was in trying to compare against other districts in the past.
I think another way to say that is that probably points to the funding lawsuit, the equity of funding from the state. And so to your point, there is issues with that, and we talked with the board over the last several years about that. That if you're a rural district, a small rural district, or you're a district that's growing, there's a variety of districts that could probably make the argument there is inequity, but certainly rapidly growing districts like ourselves, there are issues because so much of the basic education funding is just held harmless. And so if you're a rapidly growing district, or maybe the composition of your district has changed significantly because of commercial development, all of that stuff's not being appropriately accounted for at a state level with the funding formula. So.
Yeah, and it doesn't say whether one district is being more fiscally responsible than the other in another way. Like that's my issue with it, is to say, well, if our millage was at the top, doesn't make us less fiscally responsible than it did if we were at the bottom.
Just means you don't have the Carlisle Pike.
Right, exactly.
But by the way, part of that is because our township voted on that. Like, I mean, our constituents here don't want the Carlisle Pike. I mean, we could have done that on 15 years ago.
Well, it's just even more broadly, CV is whatever, 100 square miles or something, or 16. And so, millage at 11 for them gets them a $200 million budget, and millage for us at 15 gets us a $100 million budget. So it doesn't, they're not apples to apples.
These are all really good points, and I think as we kind of bring the presentation to a close, just looking back at a summary of where we are. And so again, kind of the preliminary budget deficit prior to determining the operating increase at 3.8, as we factor in what we're recommending around operations, that takes us to a total budget deficit of about $2.3 million, which is consistent with last year, and that's a total increase of 3.9%. So in terms of next steps, continued review of the general fund budget. So at April 9th, we will propose the general fund budget in its final form. And when I say final form, the budget binder is very detailed. What gets submitted to PDE is very summarized. And so that's the PDE format that we approved at the April 9th board meeting. Then it's subject to public review, and then we'll do the final adoption at the June 11th board meeting. So.
Very good. Further questions for Mr. Longwell or Dr. Leidy? Right, move on to item 4, curriculum. Item 4.01, review of special education plan 2024 through 2027.
Yes, indeed. And just basically going to turn this over to Mr. Bigham and Mrs. Bott to talk the board through. Just for the board's awareness, our obligation to you as a board is to tell you that we have this plan. Much of this plan is dictated to us from PDE and around the laws associated with special education. So.
All right, thank you, Dr. Letty. As Dr. Letty alluded to the fact, the special education plan is more of a summary report. It does have components in it that provide indicators across special education programming. Indicators will associate to the signals that we talk about with regard to evidence of how our program is responding and meeting our student needs. And tonight we're going to provide you with an overview of that plan. And again, we are going to use some of the data that we have from those indicators to indicate and show what our goals are for professional learning for staff. And Mrs. Bott, as our supervisor of special education, will lead us through that plan.
Good evening. I think I've met some of you, not all of you. I'm Jamie Bott. I'm the supervisor of special ed here. And I've been fortunate enough to serve in this position for almost 11 years. So I've been participating here through a lot of the growth that you just talked about. And it's been a wonderful journey. So just to talk a little bit about the plan that we have, as Dr. Leidy mentioned, this is largely given to us by the state. But this plan is completed every 3 years. We are actually jumping back onto our 3-year cycle. We were out of plan cycle for a year due to COVID. So our last special ed plan we actually submitted in 2022. So this is actually a 2-year plan, but really this is putting us back on track with our cycle and how to submit this. There's definitely a lot of this plan that is given to us by the state, but this document really can serve as a grounding document for the work of the department if we're using it to follow the compliance measures and really measure our own progress with our data and how our programs are servicing our students. So really the idea of this cyclical plan is to give us the opportunity to really take a deeper dive into our own information and make purposeful planning steps for the future for our students. There are 10 sections to the plan. I'm going to give you a minute to look at those. As I go through this, I'm really going to touch heavy on numbers 1, 5, and 10, 1 being the implementation and planning, 5 least restrictive environment, and 10 professional development, but there are pieces on the rest of those. To give an overall idea of specifically special education here at Mechanicsburg, there are 876 students identified for special education. Does not include students who are receiving gifted supports or students on 504 accommodations plans. So that is just students with individualized education plans. We are sitting at about 18.9% of our overall student population receiving services through special education. The state total right now for across the state, if you look at the overall percentage, the most recent statistic is a little over 19%. So we are trending right where the state is trending. In the years that I've been here, this number, our percentage has absolutely increased, but so has our overall population. So if we look at, the population growth, that population has increased, but so have our overall numbers of identified students. From last plan that was 2 years ago to this plan, those numbers are certainly increasing. Those percentages are certainly increasing. Some of the other things that have happened over the past 2 years is our department has made strides in the professional development that we placed in our last plan. We've done a lot around positive behavior supports, and that has been district-wide, but that is absolutely beneficial for students who are identified just as overall supports in our buildings in our district. We've also made continued strides in reading, partnering our side, student services, partnering with the curriculum and making that an overall solid program to serve all of our students, which absolutely affects our students, our identified population. And then also, something we're always keeping in the forefront with our case managers and those who are writing the individual education plans is the development of those documents to make sure that they really are solid documents that really do support our students.
Can I ask a question? You said that this was dictated by the state. Were these started by us and they're now being evaluated by the state, like the implementation of additional like positive behavioral support and all that? Was that their recommendation first, or was it kind of us and they're like adding to that?
Yeah, so I'm going to touch on that in a slide coming. There are certain pieces of it, we are told what areas we absolutely have to professionally develop on, and obviously we can go deeper into other areas if we'd like. The areas that the state is telling us to professionally develop on aren't grossly different from what I would say are good ideas for us to focus on. So it's not an unuseful document. It certainly is not a checkbox in the wrong direction or anything. It's certainly leading us down the path of honestly where our comprehensive plan is. So
That's right. I was
yes.
thinking of it too. It was like,
Yeah.
how well is this aligned with us?
Actually, being off cycle for that year gave a really good opportunity to gear the special ed plan completely aligned with that comprehensive plan. In past years, this plan was due first, and then we would go through a comprehensive plan cycle. And so it wasn't as aligned, I will say. But with where our comprehensive plan goals are, it dovetails so nicely into what the special ed plan is asking for, but also where we are focused as a special education department and where we're focused as a district through those goals. So it's marrying very nicely. The other place where we had some evolution was just in the growth in our department, and we've talked about staffing a lot so far this evening. It is no secret that special education has grown, and we have grown in staffing. We've added two positions at least. We've added a second administrator in the office. We've added a school psychologist, and that has been in relation to being able to meet the needs of students with the growing population that we have. In terms of indicators, and this is really the data heavy part, there are 16 indicators that they put out with data, and we have to look at that data retrospectively. 15 of those indicators are met. So we have met 15 indicators, meaning that our data is trending with the state data. There is one indicator that we did not meet, and that is it's called educational environments, but really what we're talking about is private full-time placements. So what that means, to be very specific, is placements such as Hilltop, River Rock, New Story. So these are places that are all special education students all the time, delivering a very specific and intensive level of services for the students who need that. So we did need to write an improvement plan in that area, and just looking very specifically at making sure that the kids who get placed in these placements are the kids who need those intensive level of supports, and making sure that we don't keep them there for periods of time that are longer than what they need those supports. And that comes largely through partnerships with those facilities.
When you say not meeting it, is that we're not referring enough students to, or the other way?
The other
we're referring too many?
So our percentage is over the state target percentage.
I think the word target is a really important word, because when Mrs. Bott shares this with me and I'm sitting there going, no, wait a second. The district has agreed and the parents have agreed that this is the best placement for this child, and yet because it doesn't meet a state target, we aren't meeting the state target. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And then to call it an improvement plan, well, don't get me started. But other than the fact that we take it seriously, we'll look at it. I think you have described it beautifully. Like, let's go back and say, are these children staying longer than they should in these placements? That's worth investigating to see. Are we too quick to put students in these placements? That's worth checking. I would just say to this board, I don't see significant changes in the work that we're doing specific to that area.
And I can go back and add to that, Dr. Lay talked earlier about the multiple disabilities class and the teacher and the two aides. That's building capacity within our organization, within our consortium, such that we do not have to place students in private placements. We can put them into our own program that we are running that would not qualify us for placing students in a private placement because we're building capacity within the organization. So that's one of the things that's included in the action plan in order to be able to remedy and reduce some of those numbers. And we're talking, not meeting the target. We're not talking about huge percentage of kids or a huge number of kids. So for the example of the MDS class, we're bringing 5 students back to our own district building to educate them, which in itself, if you look at the percentage, it's not statistically significant, but it's enough that with the other students that we're looking to bring back that are making progress, we're going to meet that target. But then we also don't know what the future holds for the needs of other students and what future enrollments bring. So it's constantly going to be an evaluative process, but it's something that we're mindful of.
So moving forward with this plan specifically, the requirements are to post for public review for 28 days, and then we are able to submit. But in terms of the very specific pieces in this plan and how we want to use it for the next 3 years, the first piece would be looking at the professional development areas, and specifically they call out the autism, positive behavior supports, paraprofessional trainings. Transition is for students leaving our district, so students starting at 14 and moving out into adulthood. We need to help them plan for that transition. The science of literacy, parent trainings, and IEP development. Those are the areas that we have to consider for professional development. And again, many of those are aligned with where we're going as a comprehensive plan and as a district. So those are the areas I've been able to work with individuals and add broad topics, but we really do need to spend time mapping that out and thinking about what specifically that looks like over the next 3 years with the professional development time allotted to us. We do have our 6-year audit coming up next school year, and that's going to be another opportunity to review all of our documents and all of our data and take a really intensive look at where we are with the state targets for those pieces and any action plans or improvements we need to do for those. It's a 6-year process. We'll be ready to do that in the first time slot. I'm committed to doing that right away next school year. And the third action step that we have is really monitor our indicators. And our indicators for this plan, for the audit, they're monitored based on state targets. So they're comparing us to 498 districts across the state. And really, I think what is more beneficial is collecting our own evidence. How are we doing from year to year, and then looking at that from a 3 to 5 year standpoint and making sure that our data is saying, yes, we're serving the kids that we have here. So our district looks very different, as we talked about, from a Cumberland Valley, from the other districts surrounding us, and the way that we make decisions on how to support our students looks different than other school districts. And so what's our data telling us? Is our data telling us that we do continue to use these placements at a rapid rate, and we really need to consider that? Or is it telling us, yeah, we're holding pretty steady and doing what we think we're doing? So we're going to continue to monitor our own data. We will consider it in the grand scheme of all the other targets too, but we really want to monitor where we are and the progress we're making to make sure that our services are aligning with the needs of students and really just being responsible for covering all those needs. Any questions?
And just to review, Jamie did make the comment, the next step would be for us to put the special education plan on our district website for a period of 28 days for review. And pending the fact of no negative comments from our community, we would then submit that to the state as our special education plan on May 1st.
Thanks for what you do. Love you, David.
Any other questions, comments?
I like the comment that you made at the end that we're gonna follow progress in terms of what we do here. Because if we believe that what we do here is right, then that's the most important, to me anyways, sitting on this board, that's the most important thing. Because we know that this system of special education is broken in this state. Now, this coming from a guy who's severely dyslexic and was in special education. So I really feel, I mean, I was with Mr. Rupp in special education in high school. So I just want to say that I value it a lot, but it's still broken.
If only we had an off-site place for you two to go.
Yeah, I agree. The local accountability model is something we're just going to keep looking at. So thank you both. Appreciate what you do.
Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to item 5, facilities. Item 5.01, facilities planning committee.
I'll take it.
Dr.
Thank you. So as you know, we have been working together with a group, a committee, you'll see here in a little bit, around not only looking backward, but looking forward to where do we want to be from a facilities perspective. And that's really what this slide is about. You've seen many of these slides before. We just want to bring it back to the forefront. So if you go back to 15, 16, and the role of this committee was to look all the way forward to 2030, a pretty extensive period of time. So there was our essential question, and I'm just going to read it out loud so we're all on the same page. What buildings and grounds needs will have to be addressed to best support our learning community in the next 5 to 7 years? As we were talking in the budget conversation, much credit is due to this board and previous boards around looking forward and being able to manage the spikes and the ebbs and the flows of projects that are out there. And that's really what this committee was charged to do, was to say, what do we see on the horizon? Not the specifics, and I'm going to say that probably a couple times. This isn't about the very specific projects, but looking more at larger kinds of recommendations that gives the administration a roadmap for where we want to go in the next 5 to 7 years.
So in assembling the facilities planning committee, we did have some guiding questions, and as Dr. Letty had indicated, we assembled a committee of representative stakeholders from within our school district. We had a couple board directors serve on the committee as well. Really what we were asking them to do was look at these guiding questions and say, all the way back to 15 and 16, when we did the feasibility study, we did at the time prioritize and say, here's what we think we need to do around enrollment and equity, and here's what we need to do around program and buildings infrastructure, but recognizing that now we're a number of years removed from that, 8, 9 years. So going back and kind of auditing that and saying, are there any gaps there or things we need to look at? Also though, recognizing that 2015-16 really laid the foundation for many of our construction projects. It was a long time ago, and so what needs might have come up since the construction projects began. And then ultimately, as we have worked through the construction projects, I think our board has done a very nice job of prioritizing and saying, we didn't just go out and build brand new buildings. The cost of that would have been even more than what we paid to renovate our existing buildings. In renovating our existing buildings, we did go through and say, what was the useful life of some of our infrastructure, our roofs, our HVAC units? And so we didn't just go through and replace everything just because we were renovating the building. And so we know that now we are, again, 8 or 9 years removed, and you're looking ahead 7 more years, and there's going to be some things that probably need replaced because the useful life has, it was fine back in 15, 16. Now, certain roofs or HVAC systems, things like that might need to be addressed now. And then ultimately, how can school district grounds be used more effectively? We've resituated some of these buildings in terms of renovations and additions. We also know the programs might look different, and so just continuing to study the grounds in terms of our academic program, but also what happens outside the school day, extracurricular, athletics, community use, those things. So really those guiding questions overlaid then what were we trying to get to, and so the facilities planning committee, then the focus areas were around buildings and infrastructure. We did ask to look at athletic, community, recreation, extracurricular. That was another lens. And then ultimately support spaces, knowing that the district has grown, the buildings are larger, we have more students, more programs. What does storage and office space and grounds look like? And again, all the while, a credit to the board, our administration, our teacher leaders, our staff, that we have, as a district, done a great job with a variety of committees and recommendations. And so saying, there was different program evaluations, different committee recommendations, and so over the years, we've done these things. We need to maybe go back and say, was there any facility considerations connected to the athletic program evaluation, connected to the extracurricular program evaluation, which Dr. Bitts had led for us, and the office space and storage study. So pulling in those extra pieces. So the planning committee there, I'll share in terms of the individuals. You can see district office administration. You can see some building administration from elementary all the way up to high school. Our construction manager, Dick Kastner, has been such a vital resource for us through construction and planning. And then you can also see a variety of other support administrators, I'll say, representing the different aspects of the district, everything from academic program to extracurricular, rec, athletic, and then some school board representation there in both Dr. Lebo and Mr. Sanker, who were gracious enough to join us in our meetings and conversations. So they serve on the committee as well. So knowing that we had our guiding questions, we had a committee that had certain focus areas, going back and cross-checking other committee recommendations that maybe occurred outside of the facilities planning committee, ultimately developing a prioritized listing of projects. And so what are things that are maybe ongoing required maintenance? And that is that capital reserve fund that we look at every year. It's our summer projects. That is fluid, and it does change from year to year because, what might be a need this year, that might look different in year 2, 3, 4. And so every year we're constantly evaluating, looking at things with Mr. Hoffman's leadership in the facilities department, but also our building leaders, our teacher leaders. But then we also recognize, as Dr. Lady said in the essential question, we are looking out to 7 years. And so what are things that might exist in the short term, and what are things that we want to look at further but might be longer term conversations? And so just trying to get a roadmap for what facilities needs exist. I will say that as we get to the themes here, the themes themselves were generated from individual considerations that were developed by the committee. And so in all of those areas, the building and infrastructure, in the athletic, the community, the rec, in the grounds, the support spaces, that committee did a great job of brainstorming and thinking about individual examples of things that might be needs. Our goal with the facilities planning committee to develop a prioritized listing of projects was really to kind of synthesize that list and maybe aggregate it and come back with 7 overarching, here are some aspects of the district that we want to study further and look at, but we're not necessarily endorsing the 40 or 50 things that the facilities planning committee identified individually as needs, because they require larger conversations, frankly, and there is a connectedness to all the different things they observed. And so our goal was to say, okay, now that we were down in the weeds with the facilities planning committee, we engaged a group of stakeholders and looked at all these very specific things. Now let's pull ourselves out and say, as we look ahead for 7 years, what are some general themes or areas that we know we need to maybe look at as priorities, the kind of effort that we know we want to spend as we plan and look to the future.
Can you go back just a slide to the people that were on the committee? So when you were talking about that, did you say that those people went to the other stakeholders, or is that the group of stakeholders?
So this was the committee, but many of, so I'll say we broke this committee down into subcommittees, and I don't think I probably alluded to that, and I missed that on the slide, but one of the subcommittees was building and infrastructure. One of the subcommittees was athletic, extracurricular, rec. One of the subcommittees was support areas. And so those individual subcommittees did reach out and talk to some of the other stakeholders.
So the people in the K-3 buildings were also represented as part of that conversation.
So even as an example of like support spaces, I know, not to pick on Mr. Harris, but he did a nice job of kind of pulling in other stakeholders. We had a Google Share doc that we had kind of pulled other administrators and stakeholders. And so our goal was to not just limit it to the people in the room, to your point, Mrs. Huff, like we've done with many other committees, try to have other people speak into it. And so that was our goal. So those themes, and we'll get to passing out a listing of what the individual items were that maybe the committee had observed. But first I want to just talk about the themes. And so when we looked at all the different individual items that the committee had kind of come up with, had brainstormed, the themes were around 7 areas. And so the first area was ongoing required maintenance. And so like we have as a district, and I think a credit to how we've done things in the past, we want to continue that annual capital reserve fund list, looking at our projects and saying there should be an annual assessment of buildings and grounds as part of the budget process, where we do engage our administrators or teacher leaders talking about what might be new needs that came up that maybe because here we are talking about facilities, maybe in a year there's a different set of needs. And so we want to continue to have that temperature check every year. But also that we're maintaining a cumulative listing of facility needs, and that we're prioritizing things and how are we funding them, what monies are we setting aside, and then ultimately that leads to what are estimated timelines, what are project costs, and those things. And so it's really managing that 3, 5, 7-year horizon to say what are things that are out there. The remaining 6 then we categorize as either short-term or long-term. So in short-term, finalized project wrap up at the high school. And so I'll say one thing that you can say about this, and there's a variety of considerations, but the track, for instance, is something we've talked about to make a connection. We've been setting aside some money in the capital reserve fund for track replacement, so we know that is more imminent. We know that because of the high school construction project and the need to have laydown space, that we had to get on the other side of the project, the construction project, before we could come back and talk about the track. And so that is in the short term something that we need to wrap up some aspects of the project at the high school, the track being one of the big considerations there. Another theme was around consider the building needs at the middle school. And so it's interesting, everything comes full circle. It's the story of life probably, but the middle school was built and commissioned really in the early 2000s. I think it was probably around 01, 02 maybe. And so here we are in 2024, and that building's now 22, 23 years old. And so if you think about the useful life of equipment or infrastructure, often it is 15, 20, 25 years. And we can feel that, frankly, I think, as you look at the annual capital reserve fund list, and we're going to talk a little bit later here with Mr. Hoffman, there's a couple things on the list about the middle school. And so that's going to continue to happen just because of the age of the building. And so do we need to step back and say, let's continue to look at what are some needs at the middle school? And there was some brainstorming that happened with that committee and the subcommittee, frankly. We also know, consider the building needs at Elmwood Academy. This one, I know it's been on some lists of conversations, but I think just to kind of say, I think it's probably worth repeating, but if you go back in time, all the way back to 15, 16, 16, 17, really when we began the projects, we needed to immediately address the kindergarten academy, but we also knew that enrollment was really starting to take off, and we already had mobile classrooms at many of our elementary schools. And so we were needing to do something in the near term. And so our effort really at Elmwood Academy was to transform that second floor into from office space into classrooms, which we immediately occupied following construction. And we moved the administrative offices and support offices out temporarily out of that space, so that at least we added immediate capacity to our elementary system. But in that, it wasn't a comprehensive renovation. It was, we were going to renovate the second floor, turn those offices into classrooms. And then we did come back later, and because of enrollment and some other targeted needs, did some other, I'll say, renovations to specific areas, like the core areas of the building. And so we did the media center, and we did the cafeteria, and we looked at some things like that. We also added on some classroom space because enrollment continued to grow. We saw that in our decision and say enrollment projections. But at the end of the day, we still never really did a completely comprehensive project at Elmwood Academy. And I think evidence of that is the HVAC system, where the useful life did reach to the point where we need to replace that. And that was a conversation we had even this year with the school board, where that's going to be a summer project. And so knowing there might be some considerations at Elmwood Academy that we should take a look at. And then finally, in the short term, continuing to develop some policy and or administrative regulation around things like storage and grounds. And so what's the effective use of storage? What's the effective use of grounds? And what's our standards look like? And so those are things we want to continue to study. And then in the long term, consider the needs of extracurricular, athletic, rec, and community. And so a lot of stuff that might happen outside the school day. As a growing district, you increase the number of programs, you increase how the facilities are used, the grounds, and so continuing to look at that. And then a continued assessment of needs and use of office space, storage, and grounds because again, we're adding students, we're adding staff, we're adding programs and kids, but what are we doing ultimately for some of those support aspects of the district? And so those are the 7 themes, I'll say. I do want to go ahead and pass around here for the board how we develop those 7 themes. And so if everyone would just take one and kind of pass it around. I want to just mention here something quickly. You'll see that basically what we did was we worked with a committee, we worked with a subcommittee, and we did a lot of brainstorming and said, in the areas of building and infrastructure, in the areas of athletic community rec, in the areas of support spaces, go out and talk to some colleagues, stakeholders, think about some brainstorming around what might be some needs. I'll say this, the individual needs that you see listed on this page, we're not asking the board to necessarily endorse any of those individual items. That was brainstorming that happened with the facilities planning committee. What we did administratively then was say, let's step back from it and try to categorize what are some themes around what our priorities might be in the next 7 years. And so those 7 themes are those 7 recommendations that you see that we talked about. The color coding there, again, I think this is something worth just mentioning. The color coding, obviously consider ongoing required maintenance. That's going to happen on a year-to-year basis. Those yellow recommendations, those 4 in the short term, are what we see as themes that might need addressed. I will say in the individual items, there might be things that might be addressed sooner and some that later. And so I think that's probably a little bit confusing when you look at the listing, because as an example, the track, well, there might be some other considerations that go beyond the track, but we do know that in the near term, short term, as we finalize a project at the high school, we do need to do something around the track, but there are some other considerations that the committee had brainstormed, and so we wanted to honor the committee by saying, here's the list of what they brainstormed, what they came up with, how do we categorize those, and those 7 recommendations ultimately are what we would look for the board to endorse as areas of focus in facilities planning for the next 7 years.
So I'm just going to be very blunt. We question whether to show the individual items on here because it can suck you down into the weeds very quickly and say, well, what do you mean we're doing a turf field inside the gym? That's not the purpose of this. The purpose of this is to really look at the highlighted areas and say to the administration, does this represent a roadmap of where we should be spending effort, time, and energy from a facilities perspective over the next 5 to 7 years? Every single one of these things would have to come back for a lot of consideration, a lot of planning, and obviously board approval. So just speaking as openly and candidly with you as I can, I'm begging you not to get caught up in the individual items on here, but instead to look at the bigger picture of what's highlighted, and that's what we would ask as an endorsement from the board, that yes, this does look like the committee was on the right track with what they have identified as areas and what we've put together as recommendations based on those highlights.
Are we comfortable that none of the K-3 schools are listed here?
Well, so when you think about the renovations in all of those buildings, they were all
So we're
comprehensive,
good.
complete
And even
Exactly.
consideration for numbers of kids that are coming in, we still have enough
Yep.
space for the
Yeah.
next 7 years.
Yeah, and that was all part of looking at the demographic studies that we're getting on an annual basis and looking at those numbers, that also looking at our attendance areas and making sure those attendance areas are, so all of that was taken into account with this from
Good
a
work on those
facilities perspective.
K-3s, huh? Good work on those K-3s.
Somebody must have done some good work there.
On a bigger scale, Mrs. Huff, most of the elementary schools don't have land around them as much either, whereas some of the other facilities had a lot more potential space to be developed for some of the other projects.
Yeah, I think the reality of the board forming this committee last spring was to say, we're not done once the high school project's done. Like, we're never done, right? And yet, let's not act like this is going to be an obvious answer to what's next either. And so the board committed to bringing a group of people together last spring, and it took until now really for that group to come up with what they did. And kudos to the people that were involved in it. I think they did a great job.
So I know we're not supposed to focus at all on the.
So you're going.
No, I'm just saying, Sharmanstown's not on here, so I don't know
Yeah.
if that is
It's a great point.
at a long-term facility, is that something that should be on here?
That's an excellent question. Yeah.
It is a good preview of another conversation that's going to be coming. So we have a lease with River Rock to use that facility, and so we've been talking to, we're in the last year of that lease, we've been talking to River Rock about renewing the lease, which is something we'll come back to the board with a proposal on. But as part of that process, we did engage their leadership to say, what about the building might be some of their desires? And so I think there's probably, not going into a lot of detail, there's probably 3 areas. One is some regular maintenance things. I think that Mr. Hoffman and his crew, they've already said, you know, we can take care of that. Now that's been brought to our attention. The second category is there's some things we should do because of our kind of landlord-tenant relationship, but we need a budget for those. And so we've been looking at that. And then the third area is just that there might be some big, more significant asks where that comes into what we get back in return as part of the contract. So a future conversation, so yes.
Only because 22 years I've been on the board, I came on the board because of Shirenstown didn't have grass, and it still doesn't have grass. So tear out the swing sets and grass.
Yeah.
No, I was teasing, but I just really thought that would be on here somewhere, what we're gonna do with it.
I think it's worth mentioning on the K through 3 buildings as well, that they are captured somewhat in that recommendation, number 1, because there are some required maintenance pieces, some deferred HVAC units and things like that, that will still come up through that.
I'm glad you called that out because I think that's a good connection back to the useful lives of some of the equipment. Is we didn't necessarily replace all of the rooftop units at every one of the elementary buildings. And so as an example, I'm sure there's probably some things we need to look at there, but we will continue to do that through our annual process. So as a final step here, really those 7 areas are what we're asking the board to look at in terms of looking ahead to the future. Then those areas will guide future conversations, I think is the easiest, most succinct way to say that. And so to Dr. Letty's point, this is a step in the journey to say, as we look ahead to the next 7 years, here's 7 areas that we feel need some additional investigation and kind of effort, but that we'll have additional conversations about those 7 areas if that's the board agrees those are the ones. So.
Great.
Good. Excellent. Any further questions or comments? I want to thank the 2 board members that gave their time for that, and to the committee as a whole. Much needed process. 5.02 bid results, door replacement, middle school. Mr. Longwell and Eric.
Mr. Hoffman. So I won't steal much of Mr. Hoffman's thunder here, but he's here to talk about a couple bids this evening, and so I'll just let him review both. Both are capital reserve fund items that we've identified through that annual process. And
then just for the record, I'm going to read in 5.03, which is also the bid result sewer pump replacement at the middle school. That way, Eric, you can.
Yes, sounds good. Yep. Thank you. Sure.
So, good evening, thank you. The replacement aluminum entry doors at the middle school, we discussed this at length a few months ago, and happy to get the bids in. We're looking forward to getting started on this project as soon as school lets out for the summer. These doors have been heavily used. The front entrance at the middle school might be the most heavily used doors in the district on a daily and yearly basis. They are 22 years old, and we've done as much maintenance on them as we possibly can and replaced door hardware, and we're just at the point now where we need to replace them. So looking forward to doing so. And if there's any questions on that, I'd be happy to answer them.
Did you only get the 1 bid, or is this the winner?
We only got the 1 bid.
And that seems fair and competitive.
It seemed reasonable. It's a small project, and we were a little concerned that because it's small, we wouldn't get the bidders, and we did get one, which we were happy with, and it's a contractor that we're very familiar with, so we're happy with that.
And I would just add, from a safety perspective, obviously we see this as important as we had already discussed, but it does address some of the safety questions that have been out there. So.
Another question, comments? Eric, if you want to take the other.
Yes, the sewage ejection pump replacement at the middle school. Again, we discussed this quite a bit a few months ago. The cost includes those items there on the page: pumps, controls, transmitters, the radar level, wiring, conduits to a new panel. And this would be another summer project that we would try to get done as soon as possible in order to it to be up and running properly by the time school comes around at the end of August. Lots of projects and small projects happening at the middle school this year, intertwined with all the programs that are happening. So it will be a fun, action-packed summer at the middle school, but I'm sure we can handle it, and we'll be able to communicate to everybody what's happening at any given day.
So Eric, do we have to pump up before it goes down? Is that what they're doing, or
We pump out to
straight up, like a lateral type?
Will this involve any, like, service or program delays that you can't use the bathroom at the middle
We're
school?
used to that.
No, yeah, right. No, but seriously.
There will be a shutdown at some
So
point.
there'll be like a total building shutdown?
And we will, that's something we're gonna have to, once we meet with the contractor to go over a schedule that we're gonna have to figure out. And we'll handle that properly the best way we can to not interrupt all the programs that will be happening. So I'd be looking to do it on a day, a Friday, a Saturday, if possible. And everything will be communicated to the school and the organizations there.
So do we have a lot of summer school classes going on there? for the
Yeah, we
first
just,
6 weeks?
just looked this morning at a spreadsheet of everything that's happening in the summer. We can no longer say that we close in the
No.
summer. It is, we should add up the number of students that we actually are providing services to in the summer. It's pretty impressive. So, yeah. But again, credit to the board of allowing Eric to bring that forward in the capital reserve when he did, so we can get that out for bid, because now he has to coordinate with those programs about when this project takes place. And if we waited until June to make these decisions, it would just be chaos. So thanks to the board for your flexibility with that.
And thanks for what you and your department do, Eric. It does not go unnoticed.
Thank you.
Great job.
All right, and we'll move those forward to the April meeting for a vote. But with that, thank you, Mr. Hoffman.
Thank you, sir.
Meeting's adjourned, and we'll have a quick executive session, matter of personnel.
Good night.
Thanks, sir.